nuclear waste simply tossed into the water. This was the face of waste disposal for decades. Greenpeace activists tried to prevent this, in vain. So what's the story behind all this dangerous radioactive waste in the sea? We have been conducting research for a year now in an attempt to find out what became of the barrels of nuclear waste. We also discovered pipes through which the nuclear waste is pumped into the sea. We visited fish markets, met experts.
Sediment and animal. And so for that, we need to measure.
As well as a lot of people who are scared about radiation. We asked politicians about the legacy of the nuclear industry, what's actually going on down there at the bottom of the sea. And because the answers turned out to be unsatisfactory, we went looking for the barrels of nuclear waste ourselves. We are going to get to the bottom of what happened in the past. We want to know, where is it radioactive, and what is the source of radiation off the coasts of Europe? Anything radioactive was dumped in those steel barrels. Contents: low-level radioactive waste from hospitals, but also radioactive waste from nuclear plants across Europe. For decades, the nuclear industry has used the sea as a dump site. May 1967. In the port of Emden, Lower Saxony, nuclear waste from Germany, Britain, and France will be loaded onto the British cargo ship Topaz. The barrels are to be dumped in at least 4,000 meters of water. The nuclear waste was supposed to be diluted by the water. This is considered to be an absolute certainty. The British crew of the Topaz dumps the radioactive load into the sea. More than 100,000 tons of nuclear waste disappear into the North Atlantic, the Irish Sea, but also into the shallow waters of the English Channel. Then in the mid-1970s, Greenpeace stages various actions and raises awareness about these dumping activities. An outcry resounds across Europe. "32 years after the boat operations in the Atlantic, we meet two of the activists from that time at the Greenpeace offices in Hamburg. Harold Zindler and Roland Hipp haven't seen one another for a long time. Both fought with great conviction and commitment against the dumping. We show Harold Zindler the video footage. Even today, years later, a chill runs down his spine.
This is cynical.
But the nuclear industry was unmoved by the Greenpeace actions. The dumping continued. Environmentalists were criminalized and attacked.
Then we were taken captive on the ship and were locked up in the bow. The dumping continued and we could hear it, and what we had just witnessed actually happened. A dinghy was hit again, and at that point the action was called off. It was far too dangerous and people could have been injured or even killed.
These events took place more than 3 decades ago. What has happened to the nuclear waste down there on the ocean floor since then? Who knows anything more about it?
Come in. Thank you.
We meet with the nuclear physicist John Large in London. He was involved in the development of a British atomic bomb in the 1960s and knows a lot about the dumping, particularly by the military. Large owns an extraordinary souvenir, a non-radioactive fuel rod from the Sellafield nuclear facility. Fuel rods of this kind were sunk deep in the ground. Large tells us something surprising.
The men on the ship were being exposed to radioactivity while they were on the ship. So the ship was making its way to its dump site. Those men were like ticking clocks. The longer they stayed near the waste, the better. So it was on the captain to actually reach his allocated dump site within a certain time. If the ship ran into weather difficulties or was making a bad headway, it was slow, the captain was not concerned necessarily about where to dump the waste, but the time that the crew were being, and himself, were being exposed to radioactivity. So when the clock ran out, that's when they dumped. So there can be no assurance that the radioactive waste was dumped where the civil servants said it was dumped.
So how can these barrels ever be located for, say, control purposes? A look at official British dumping inventories raises even more doubt about the accuracy of the information. Entries relating to coordinates or ocean depths are often marked "not known." It gets worse. Even when it comes to information regarding radioactivity, we repeatedly read "not known, not known, not known." This is according to an inventory of dumpings in the Irish Sea. Who could possibly know where the barrels are located? Perhaps the UK Health Protection Agency, HPA, might be able to help, as it is responsible for radioactive waste. We meet Dr. John Cooper, departmental head of the Center for Radiation, Chemical, and Environmental Hazards. He knows all about the problem of dumped nuclear waste barrels. Can it really be that the dumping inventories are incorrect?
I would be surprised if there were other disposals which were not included, but of course you cannot completely exclude that.
The military did never tell you what they dump. So what do you do with this fact?
Well, I think at some point you have to rely on the information you've got.
The UK nuclear reprocessing site Sellafield, formerly Windscale. The atomic waste also came from here and disappeared into the Irish Sea, into the Channel, into the Atlantic. The suspicion, highly radioactive nuclear waste may have been dumped. It was officially banned.
If you look at the inventories, the analysis of materials that have been recovered from the seabed that have only come from dumping, not atmospheric testing, from dumping, there's no doubt in my mind that high-level waste has been physically dumped at sea.
That would mean that the inventories are incorrect in this particular. How could such errors occur? Are they actually errors at all, or was it intentional?
Powers that are written in a future.
Michael Meacher might know more about this. He was Minister of State for the Environment from 1997 to 2003 and an opponent of the dumping policy.
Charging for workplace parking levies and other measures which local authorities will put into their local charge.
Today, the former senior minister in Tony Blair's cabinet is an ordinary backbencher. We show him the inventories. Who made false statements? Who knew anything about the dumpings?
I'd be very glad to have a copy here, and it's often likely to be a minor. The Commission will give guidance and advice to ensure.
I suspect that was an agreement between the Ministry of Defence, the Army, and the nuclear industry. I presume this was, I won't say a plot, but this was an agreement between them all to do something which they would rather not anyone knew about. And that's why it's now impossible to get the information about exactly what was dumped, where it was dumped. I think we have a pretty good idea where it was dumped, but we don't know, and the quantity of it we certainly don't know, and the effects of dumping that in the sea over decades or centuries, again, we don't know. I mean, this is a sort of conspiracy.
Even Greenpeace didn't know at that time how bad it was, but the protests were successful. The dumping of nuclear waste was forbidden worldwide in 1993. Greenpeace activists were celebrated as heroes, as in the case here in Vigo, Spain. For more than half a century, barrels of nuclear waste had been dumped into the sea in keeping with the motto at the time: the solution of pollution is dilution.
The fundamental underlying problem was that they assumed that if you dilute the radioactivity with tons and tons of water, it's safe to discharge. If you dump solid radioactive waste and it dissolves in tons and tons and tons of water, then it's safe to dispose of it in that way. And that is being proved wrong time and time and time again.
The first evidence that dangerous, highly toxic waste, which has accumulated over the years, simply doesn't disappear through dilution, was gathered by experts after an exploratory trip in the mid-1980s. Germany sent the research vessel Walter Herwig to the Atlantic dump sites. The disposal points were examined. In so doing, the scientists inadvertently salvaged 9 barrels. The researchers found plutonium in the water, in the seabed, and in the fish. Internal papers from the Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, state increased concentrations of plutonium in the dump sites indicate plutonium leaks from the barrels. So now the toxins have finally arrived in the biosphere. Monaco, seat of the IAEA's marine laboratories. Biologists here are researching the dangers of nuclear waste in the sea. This is the head of the laboratory, Dr. Hartmut Nies. The experts feed contaminated food to marine animals. They want to find out how it will affect the organisms. Dr. Nies and his colleagues are also in charge of the barrels of dumped nuclear waste. The key question is, what happened to the barrels? Are there still any undamaged barrels down there after all these years? Or are they all corroded?
We examine the ocean floor constantly in any case, and we would certainly have noticed any barrels.
So you would assume that the barrels in the English Channel would all have rusted open or have simply gone?
I would assume so.
And if you would now find undamaged barrels, wouldn't it be better to salvage them?
If it's not going to cost me a lot to get them out, of course. Yes, yes.
There hasn't been a single new investigation into the dump sites for 12 years. Is Nies right? Are all the barrels corroded? We decide to have a look for ourselves. Herd Deep, an underwater channel in the channel close to the Channel Islands, is the only dump site within range of our resources and capabilities. We have chartered a boat. Herd Deep is approximately 10 nautical miles northwest of the Channel Islands, Alderney. A small submarine is supposed to provide us with video images. The unit is almost impossible to maneuver because the English Channel is known for its strong currents. The Greenpeace activist Harold Zindler is on board.
If I had the resources, I would fetch up a barrel immediately and dump it on the doorstep of those responsible. It is irresponsible. More than 28,000 barrels of nuclear waste have been dumped there. It's unbelievable.
Herd Deep's special attribute: thousands of barrels of nuclear waste are not stored at a depth of 5,000 meters, but are sitting there in a mere 100 meters of water. Tension mounts. According to the inventories, there are munitions from the war down there, as well as nuclear waste. What are we going to find? We filmed a nuclear waste barrel on the first dive, undamaged. So there are sealed barrels still down there which could be salvaged. Of course, we are not permitted to salvage the barrel. On the second dive, we also discover this totally corroded barrel. Up on the boat, the find leaves Harold Zindler upset.
What shocked me most here? We discovered barrels very close to land in 140 meters of water in a place where we can even see Alderney and are looking towards France, which is barely 30 minutes away.
We return to Alderney. What does this find mean for the residents of the island? Professor Chris Busby approaching Alderney. The physicist was here decades ago. A doctor had asked him to come. There was an unusually high incidence of cancers on the island. Busby has been actively campaigning against the dangers of nuclear radiation for years now. He is regarded as something of an enfant terrible, stubborn and awkward. Rather than to listen to his pointed opinions, he is the sort of person whom the authorities prefer to stigmatize. Alderney is a peaceful place. Time passes more slowly here than elsewhere. It has a total of 2,400 residents. The island is also a refuge for well-to-do British pensioners. But the place may not be as idyllic as it at first seems. To our surprise, Busby first of all takes us to the cemetery. According to the thesis, you have to look for the victims. That will tell you more than any maximum radiation levels.
35. Where?
There. No, for 50.
So you only need to find one case of childhood leukemia on the whole island, and you've got an answer. You've got too many childhood leukemias. Too many. Another LIAM.
We try to find out whether there really is an increased incidence of cancer deaths. However, the UK government keeps the precise statistics under lock and key. Data protection policy. Perhaps we'll find clues on the island. We take a stab at it and ask in the residential area near the cemetery about causes of death.
One of the estate agent's first wives died from a brain tumour, And then when we came over a few years ago, his second wife has had a brain tumour, but I think she's all right now. And there was actually a series on the television in England about operations where they filmed them live. And they filmed a chap having a brain tumour removed, and we found out that he was from Alderney, and he in fact died last year. But I think there's been a child here, at least one child with a brain tumour. We're going back to England.
Statistically speaking, this would be very noticeable, but the authorities have only one thing to say to Chris Busby. Everything is fine.
Wow. Right.
The professor goes with us to the beach. He wants to measure radiation. The competent UK authorities argue that both the quantity and levels of radiation were far too low to cause harm to people.
What we have learned since the 1980s is that material that goes into the sea comes back to land. And it does this because the particles on the seabed, the very fine particles, attract the radioactivity, attract the plutonium and attract the cesium and all the other stuff.
Professor Busby wants to go even further out. Dusk begins to fall and the tide starts to come in. Busby criticizes the authorities because they didn't do any of their own measurements, but simply guesstimated the levels of radioactivity out there in Herd Deep.
I would expect to find cesium-137, ruthenium-106, a whole load of stuff. Plutonium.
Plutonium?
Yeah, for sure.
So that might be quite poisonous here.
Well, of course.
Chris Busby's gamma spectrometer measures increased levels of radiation at this point.
204.
But there was a hell of a lot of uranium from the Herd Deep. They dumped an enormous amount of enriched uranium in the Herd Deep. That was a very big amount of material there, so it's entirely possible that that also has ended up here.
We also take readings with our Geiger counter. It is true, the level of radiation has increased. How dangerous is this for the people here on Alderney?
Only requires one cell to be damaged to go on to form another cell and another cell and another cell and eventually form cancer. So every single dose, right down to a single radionuclide decay, has a finite probability of causing cancer.
Is Busby on the right track, the outsider? And shouldn't the undamaged barrels be salvaged as a precaution? What does the director at the HPA, Dr. John Cooper, have to say?
I don't think there was a great risk, a significant risk from the disposals at Herd Deep.
Even if it is only 100 meter.
Yeah, it's probably something you wouldn't do these days. I think the best way of approaching this is to leave the material where it is.
We chase up the Atomic Energy Agency, competent in these matters. How does the agency evaluate the dangers of these dumped barrels?
We have seen that the sea's capacity for dilution is so vast. We have seen in the discharges from Sellafield and La Hague, which have drifted with the currents over many years, that if this water were not seawater, then it would be suitable as drinking water.
However, there are differing opinions about this. Professor Klaus Gruppen has published textbooks on radiation protection. So, what about dilution in seawater to levels that would meet the standards required of drinking water? And is everything really hunky-dory?
If the amount in which it is diluted is infinitely vast, if I discharge it into outer space, then it might be well diluted. But the Earth is a very small celestial body, and the concentration is constantly growing.
Our conclusion: the radioactivity is only spreading out instead of disappearing altogether through dilution. There are no exact details about the location and number of barrels, and there is disagreement as to whether they should be salvaged. The dumping of nuclear waste in the sea was banned worldwide in 1993, yet the nuclear industry has come up with other ways. They no longer dump the barrels at sea. They built kilometers of underwater pipes through which the radioactive effluent now flows freely into the sea. One of these pipes is situated in Normandy. It comes from the French reprocessing plant at La Hague. Greenpeace protested here too, underwater. To environmentalists, the matter is clear-cut. This method of disposal through pipes destroys the environment, just like the dumping of barrels. The advantage for the nuclear industry, no more bad press because of the barrels. For the disposal via waste pipes remains hidden from the public eye, quite literally. La Hague is the waste processing plant servicing nuclear waste from all over Europe. Germany's casters rolling into Normandy. But the people here are no longer willing to accept the abuse of the sea as a nuclear dustbin. David Boyer is a physicist, founder, and chairman of an environmental group. He is visiting a local primary school today and telling the children about radioactivity, toxic plutonium, and nuclear waste. David Boyer asks us to come with him to the fish market. The physicists criticized the assessment criteria relating the health of marine organisms. According to him, Fukushima has changed things. We need to rethink. One can no longer say clean water equals clean fish equals healthy fish.
Some of them contaminated and some of them not. It's more difficult with fish because they move around. So one fish picked up someplace, might have been in a radioactive plate, get contaminated. So in these mussels, you might find something.
So what could be found in this mussel, for example?
Some of the radioactive elements discharged by the reprocessing plant, like iodine, cobalt. So it's more like gambling, huh? Like you might be lucky or unlucky.
The toxic waste from the reprocessing plant at La Hague is no longer a just local problem for the people of Normandy. According to Boyer, marine pollution is a European problem.
If you balance the benefit against the detriment, this benefit is almost zero, except for the local economy. But as a global point of view, it's zero. And the detriment is evident, so of course it is a sin.
Boyer travels with us to Ostend, Belgium, 400 kilometers from La Hague. He will show us how far the radioactive toxins have already spread, for their origin has been precisely measured. He meets up with a Belgian activist. He gathers seaweed. The environmental activist